We're back with part four of my top 50 albums of all time. This mysterious glyph of praying hands is the album cover to our 20th album on the list, Dean Blunt's The Redeemer. So, this album I would describe is the internal sound of someone's mind, of a man adrift in the city, adrift in his own memories, adrift in his feelings. So what does that actually mean? It's kind of like a sound collage, like I was talking about with Elisa Crampton's work. It's built up of a myriad number of sources. There's a lot of original recordings, a lot of samples, a lot of reappropriations of kind of iconic songs, iconic noises, and all of it, of course, is centered around Dean Blunt himself, his mega smooth but mega sorrowful voice. The punctuation, I think, of this album by kind of like skits almost, where we hear answering machine messages. And I find these especially haunting because it's like those would be the exact sounds that either echo in his mind or perhaps he's playing them on repeat. But it's like an audio file that is born out of like real circumstances that can be transplanted wholesale into the music. I think is like quite interesting, kind of conceptually. Not that I'm suggesting that these are like actually messages he got. I'm sure that they were like staged for the purposes of telling the story of the album, which seems to be about the ending of a relationship. But yeah, it just serves as this like really kind of painful echo throughout the album. It's very defiant of genre, of song structure and form, and of any one mood. Um, I'd say overall there's quite a sorrowfulness to it, but many different flavors of that sorrow. And I feel like when you're in this kind of place, when you're nostalgic and thinking about something you've lost, it isn't single note. You actually have a rich diversity of feelings, kind of going through the day, feeling your memories triggered by various things. And some sounds on this thing are just jaw-droppingly gorgeous, and I think it reflects a lot of confidence in the sonic brilliance of his compositional choices. And I would call this confidence almost Kanye-esque, insofar as, excuse me, the way that like songs develop, the way certain sounds are brought in, they only really work at all if they're having like a major emotional effect on you. If a sample comes in and it doesn't really like resonate, then it's just kind of like nonsensical. So there's so much confidence in conveying this emotional space to the listener, such that the listener is there every step of the way, and that each new development hits the listener just as hard as it did Dean himself during the composition. I think it's quite interesting that like this album, which is very kind of self-effacing, self-critical, seems very kind of like melancholy and kind of abandoning of hope, still in many ways shines because of its confidence. Yeah, he's very eager to stimulate listeners in all zones of emotions. And here I use the term musical fetishism, which it's kind of difficult to explain what I mean by this, but you know those sounds that just resonate with you so specifically, they give you some really deep, inexplicable, like ASMR type of feeling almost. It seems like rare that musicians will aim for that specifically. It's more that that sort of thing kind of incidentally overlaps in like a minor element of the song. But Dean Blunt is kind of curious to explore those places alongside you. My recommended tracks are Flaxen. This one is just like very straightforwardly beautiful, I think. It's a good representation of the kind of synth sound that he often uses, where it seems almost like pastiche. It seems almost like they're tongue in cheek, but is still so undeniably beautiful in the way it's composed. And it's a good example of the confidence, too, that the way this track kind of doubles down on what makes it itself. If that makes sense. Like, it's only through the fact that Dean Blunt is sure that he did a good job composing it that the song develops like it does. and Pappy, which I think is just like a really good representation of the vocal tracks. The feeling of Dean Blunt wandering about the city, singing sorrowfully, "You bring out the best in me," which is a line that the more you contemplate the meaning of it, the sadder it gets. And it ends on one of my favorite moments of the whole album, just an amazing sonic moment. In general, the countdown to New Year's and the cheering crowd. That just, I don't know, it feels so aesthetically rich. It feels like it kind of seeps a melancholy into so many otherwise happy memories. Powerful, powerful stuff. Okay, moving along into the teens, we have this at number 19, Death Grips' double album, The Powers That Be. I always thought this album cover was so mysterious. Does this say Death Grips? I think it must, right? It kind of looks like it, but it seems to be missing some letters and stuff too. So did they actually scratch this onto like a porthole or something? Like what is this? Like what is any of this? I genuinely don't know. So yes, this is an even crazier album release cycle than T-Lop. I already called T-Lop the craziest of my life, but that was just to build up dramatic suspense for this one. Yeah, so they announced a double album. They released the first disc and said the second disc was coming soon. Then 284 days passed. And finally, after a few teasers and false starts and fake leaks and any other kind of music release drama you could imagine, disc 2 arrived. I remember I was pretty active on the 4chan board Mew at the time, the music board, and there was just constantly Death Grip threads on the front page. People were convinced that there was like a whole hidden ARG type guerrilla marketing campaign, and the second disc was like actually already out there somewhere. We just had to untangle all of these clues and stuff. But none of that ended up being true. But people were really losing their minds and just constantly arguing and debating about what it was going to sound like, what directions would they go. And I think a big part of why even the sound of the album attracted this kind of controversy is that the first disc was insane. Like, truly and completely one of the most mind-bending pieces of media I can think of. Friends on the Moon is full of these Bjork-infused synths where they took, I believe, original recordings that Bjork submitted purely because she wanted to collaborate. Cool. That they converted into samples that they put onto some sort of sample pad, presumably, and then just spammed over top of these cascading spirals of wild despair and alien energy. You know, they say the moon, but it feels many, many planets beyond that. Lyrically, it's all over the place. You get this very bizarre, kind of obtuse humor, almost like obnoxious humor, talking about, isn't it fun to drive the bus? Mixed with these really kind of understated but undeniably bleak messages of futility, of desperation. And you're left in a really weird emotional space if you try to like follow kind of on a conceptual level what the album is actually talking about. But more and more, it just kind of feels like you have to abandon yourself to it, that you have to sink into the same level of insanity in order to fully appreciate what's going on. It's a challenging experiment. And in a career marked by challenging experiments, this is one that divided even the loyalist of Death Grips fans. I think it's one of my favorite pieces that they've ever done. Like, in terms of like the sound they create here, I think this is one of my favorite directions they've gone. But what really makes this special isn't this album on its own, or even the next album on its own, but the contrast and combination of the two. Because when Jenny Death came out, it turned absolutely everything we expected on its head. It went in directions that I don't think anyone could have guessed they would go. It's some of their more traditional but like really ambitious structuring and strong songwriting, like They just seem to really want to make good, substantial songs on this one. After a few albums, especially Friends on the Moon, that seemed more driven by kind of like conceptual type things about establishing a type of sound or one kind of idea fix, some monomaniac idea. This one was more like, we're gonna make an album. We're gonna make some good ass songs on this album. And because of that, there's some really impressive compositions on here, some really ambitious structuring and stuff. They go through all of their major modes. There are still the bizarre, twisted comedy stuff like piss piss, to more of the anthemic things that put them on the map in the first place. The classic "I light my torch and burn it" kind of mentality, struggle unto triumph. But from there, it starts going in shockingly traditional directions. It's very punk, which is a genre that they've always been kind of on the edge of. But it starts incorporating like cornerstone elements of classic rock, like dad rock era classic rock, like the organ sound that they invoke on a few of these tracks wouldn't be out of place in any like 1960s classic rock jam. And to see them go in that direction is so surreal that they've made an entire career out of doing the unexpected. So I suppose the most expected thing, or the most unexpected thing at this point is something that seems passé, seems like it's been done too many times before. But then, oh my God, they just pull it off so well. It's incorporated so perfectly into the things we've already come to death grips for, that MC Ride's wild, untamed lyricism over top of this kind of classic rock instrumentation. It feels like something entirely new and yet drawing on the best of so many things we've heard in the past. Yeah, I don't know. I'm clearly a big fan of this one. The overall feeling, I would say, that this album gives me is like, first you have your late night kind of hallucinatory manic depression where you're constantly reading the internet and overstimulated and overthinking everything and drawing all together these crazy patterns of gigantic conspiracies that prove that everything is futile and hope is dead. And then finally things wear off, the sun comes up, and you have a nice clear-headed manic depression where you realize that all of the madness you believed before isn't true, but that in itself is more proof than ever that things are quite hopeless, and now it's just kind of a nice, straightforward raging against the world. Neither of these modes might sound any fun, sure, but I don't think you can deny how powerful the effect of this album is. Okay, my recommended tracks, one from each disc. First, Have a Sad Come, the beginning of which I think encapsulates this entire kind of spiral of despair feeling. It just feels like your sanity is pouring out of your gray matter when that Bjork sample starts shifting. Oh, it's so good, it's so good. And then on GP, the big finale of Jenny Death. Maybe this is like kind of spoilers. I think it is much more powerful if you listen to it in context. But again, it's such a good song, and it's actually kind of, I think, one of their most approachable songs in some way. Insofar as it has a lot of these traditional classic rock elements, and MC Ride's vocals are certainly like wild, but they feel like kind of like that's the aggressive element on top of things that you might kind of more easily approach, if that makes sense. But the real draw of this song, I think, the fantastic playing and the structuring and MC Ride's amazing performance aside, is the lyrics. And this one, I think, again, if you really want to confront things, if you want to dive into the inferno, if you want to look the beast dead in its eyes, this song lyrically says a lot of very powerful, resonant things. So yeah, check it out. Have fun. have a fun listen, baby. Next, we have Panda Bear's Tomboy. The cover art is someone who just listened to On GP while reading the lyrics and really thinking about them. Yes, so you might be surprised. This is minor spoilers, I suppose, but this is the only Animal Collective related release on the list. Again, I'm just pointing this out to pat myself on the back. In kind of my earlier days of getting into music, I was just like kind of over the top fandom-y, that I would support the artists I like infallibly and just convince myself that every single thing they put out was like a beacon from God themselves, and that I just like absolutely had to love it. Now I only do that with Joanna Newsom. No, her stuff is legitimately all great. But yeah, I feel like in previous decades I would have been marked by, you know, like the same artist 6 times in a row, or associated artists. Because yeah, I love Animal Collective. I love a lot of the stuff that their members do. And I think the reason why is it doesn't feel like I'm being repetitive when I list so many things by these artists, because everything they do is so different from everything else you've heard by them. So what's going on with Tomboy? We have Surfer Drone. And I remember when this came out, it felt like this was kind of the next wave, that a lot of stuff like, I don't know, Beach House was blowing up at the time, and a lot of like chill wave stuff, and we had Waves, who now is some sort of shitty scum slumlord or something, making albums like King of the Beach. It seemed like everybody was eager for some kind of big surfer band. And Panda Bear, once more, as Animal Collective artists often are, it was like one step ahead. Soundtracking not the sunny party at the beach, but the gray days when only the real devoted are still out there. Surfer Drone. It felt like maybe it would surge all around us. For a second, the wave hit us, but it was washed back into the ocean of hypothetical sound just as quickly, along with sea punk and witch house and micro house and all the other genres of the year that now don't get made so much anymore. So we have big beats. I love the drums on this album. Just solid driving forces behind these hypnotic melodies that drift across these imagined low gray skies. There's cascading kaleidoscopes that build their way out of this, that even though the kind of setting of it feels mundane and gray and not full of potential, suddenly you're just swept up in all of this music flowing around you. It both progresses and suspends you in the very essence of it. And all of this, of course, invigorates Noah Lennox, Panda Bear, in the center, his wonderful, wonderful vocal performance. It's drifting and raw, full of this longing for the, I don't know, some more perfect world, feeling kind of like the most melancholy tracks of Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys. It surfaces and then submerges again. But at the same time, it's so powerful in its quest to kind of bring out this warmth. It's so unrelentingly sincere. The messages are always of love, appreciation, understanding, coming out of your shell and connecting to people about the most important things. This is something that I really love and respect Panda Bear for, is his willingness to make music that just gets across the wonderfulness of friendship and camaraderie and love, without, you know, trying to become disaffected or too cool or whatever. My recommended tracks: You Can Count on Me, the opener, which is quite hymnal, almost like a poem. I don't know. It's just very straightforward and beautiful, and I think encapsulates a lot of Panda Bear's mission statement. And then Alsatian Darn, a later track that is just the perfect example of this kind of kaleidoscope of sound. The way things build up, the structures change from this beginning, which is just the solid beat, to all of this stuff kind of spilling and spiraling. So wonderful, and the lyrics I think are quite I don't know, quite evocative. Even though they're so cryptic, even though they seem so simple, I find myself thinking of lines from this song in such a variety of contexts, and they always seem to resonate. Okay, next we have these hippies out on a lawn. This is Big Thief's UFOF, the unidentified flying object friend. So of course we talked about this a lot on the 2019 list, and at the time I really emphasized this idea that one of the great joys of this album for me is that I never thought I wanted this. I listened to it kind of on a whim, quite skeptically, thinking that this kind of genre of music just really wasn't for me. I'm not really sure why I was so convinced of that, but it was mind blowing to see how much I seemed to actually want this, how much I kind of almost needed something like this in my life. And I forget sometimes. If I go a long period without listening to this, I become a little skeptical. I find myself thinking, I don't know, what was the big deal about this album? Should it really be number 17? But when I hear it again, when I hear that opening strumming, the drums, her magical vocals, I'm transported back to that alternate world 60s that I talked about in the 2019 list, to a place of such simple bliss. But really, though, this album isn't simple at all. And I feel bad that on the 2019 list, I really understated the meaning and the emotional depth that all of the stories on this album really do convey something quite deliberate and significant and have a message behind them. But I'll do the same here and kind of gloss over that, right? Like, there's the beautiful interweaving of memories and conversations, fantasies are so rich, and yet the emotional impact when you're listening to it can really just be quite singular. That you're transplanted to this other place, that you're taking in the atmosphere and the joy of it. And not really considering the depth of everything that's being said. And in order to puzzle that out, I leave that as an exercise to you. We don't have time to cover it right now. But I love that kind of optional depth, I guess I would say, where it's just a good listen, and yet whatever effort you put into seeking meaning from it will be substantially rewarded. That, in my mind, is the very definition of literary, is that it rewards such explorations, but then in my mind, the very definition of a good listen is that it doesn't necessarily require it. I feel like if I got into this sort of folksy, hippie stuff genre, there's probably a lot of music that I'd end up loving. But sometimes it's like one particular album will stand out to you, will become special to you. Maybe just mostly because of the way you encountered it. But I've gone and listened to Big Thief's other albums, all of them very critically appraised to about the same level, and none of them just hit the way this one did. This one, I think, is going to remain special to me. And so why fight that? Why deny that this one is the one that means a lot? For the recommended tracks, I'll again recommend ones that I didn't before. Century is very light, kind of precise and jazzy. I think it displays really well the talent of the drummer, especially, and just their devotion to a very immaculate performance. And then Jenny, from right near the end of the album, is a lot more experimental. It has some of the more abrasive elements that I was talking about before. It feels very sparse and kind of desolated. And it's just a really compelling contrast to this kind of lushness that emerges from before. So yeah, really, really cool album. Never thought I would love it this much. Next we have Frank Ocean's Blonde. This one is tough to talk about. In the same way that Channel Orange brought us into a tornado of Frank's West Coast life. We're cast into a world not that we've seen on TV or in magazines before, but a completely brand new world. It's a world of pure emotion. It's beyond time or space. It's pure hallucinatory evocation, that you're not picturing something that really exists, but some emotional space. And yet it is still evocative. It still takes you somewhere. It still feels like there's a dramatis personae and stuff. There's feelings that have no name, that are built from indescribably complex chains of meaning, of memory and association going back through years and years of your life and many, many people. And yet, magically, somehow through this music, they're conveyed to us in that final kind of crystallized form that Frank experiences in composing. Now we feel too. Just magically, it's there. But it isn't magic, though. Everything is really meticulously crafted and performed on this album. The lyrics are placed perfectly in the superposition of the personal and universal. How many times have I praised something like that? It feels like Frank bears his innermost part of his soul, and then you find that happens to be the most vulnerable part of your own. You recognize, after layers and layers and layers of meaning and memory, that you might not have any relation to at all, something that still seems so familiar, something that opens up like a mirror into your own heart. Of course, this is all delivered in Frank's immaculate vocal performance. He has tremendous range, and on this album, I think more than any, he allowed a certain rawness to come through, that it feels like the emotion grips him and catches him and surges him in some other direction. But this highlights even more just how amazing his voice is, that he's able to be so free, to be so uninhibited, and still deliver such consistently smooth and rich and beautiful vocals. The production pulls these elements in really wildly contradictory directions. And this is the only way to take us someplace so far away that we've never even seen before. And yet, in line with this contradictory, it's somehow nostalgic. It's really hard to talk about the production of this album. It's so unique. It's so all over the place. And as I said, often contradictory, that it seems to juxtapose ideas that are trying to take the song in two completely opposite directions. And then like some bizarre, wrong, warp, multiple cutscene playing at the same time glitch. we get warped to a debug room of the human heart that we were never meant to see. I'm so sorry for using such a nerdy analogy on such a cool album, but that's what just came to mind to me right now. And yeah, every single rule of structuring, of song mastering is thrown out the window. Both by song and just in the overall construction of the album, to meet these impossible ends. They do everything that doesn't make sense, and yet it just works. It works so well. I mean, I don't know. Is any of what I'm saying making sense? I used some bizarre like 3D Zelda analogy here, because that's what I've been left with. That's the only thing I can use to talk about this album now. It's only going to get more wild from here, just trust me. So my recommended track's Pink and White, an early song on the album. It's just so poppy and catchy and beautiful, kind of a straightforward pop banger, and yet just the things that do make it unique, like the sort of aesthetic space it occupies, I think is a really good showcase of what makes Frank's music so magical, compared to the dozens of musicians who could, I don't know, come up with that same hook. Something about there's this piano chord. Dun 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 dun. Just the way the little melody ends by just hitting this one chord over and over again. Oh, it's like so. How do you think of something like that? Like, how do you know that's going to sound good? And then Nights. Oh, what a masterpiece. It's like a little mini pyramids. It has two kind of major parts, and the transition between the two is just awe-inspiring. It's the sort of thing that keeps you up at night because you just want to listen to it like over and over and over again. So good. Okay, next we have this Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly. Speaking of albums that are difficult to talk about, oops, I'm still up here. How do I begin to approach this? This is easily the most discussed album of the entire decade. What more could I possibly try to say about it? It's one where having it like only number 15 Trying to justify why I think there's 14 albums better than this feels like more of a necessary task than explaining why this album is on my list at all. So, such is the reputation it has. So how would you describe something like this? A genre-spanning odyssey of blackness in America, told on the level of the personal and cultural and mystical and universal simultaneously. That's Joycean. So you know I love it. The impact this album had in terms of the issues that it brought into kind of mainstream discourse, the controversial performances, the messaging of Kendrick in the media, it had reverberations through every level of American culture. And we still feel those rumblings today. I think it hopefully will never stop, because this was, you know, well, I don't know how to describe it, but it was something special. It was a moment. And I think this is actually quite notably powerful in the way that it can bring people into understanding these issues. That even if you just have passing knowledge of racial suffering in America, the depth of Kendrick's vulnerable yet powerful performance, the way he makes these issues so compelling, he speaks to them so poetically and tragically and beautifully, that you'll be really deeply affected anyways. And I think because of that, it's such a powerful tool in helping people understand the significance of these things happening. You know, I don't know, like, so far I've talked about why I guess this is like an important album, but I hope this never overshadows its reputation as just a really fantastic listening experience. Like, when I talk about this genre-spanning odyssey, just thinking about this album on the sonic level is mind-blowing. The places it goes, the long spoken word sections, the crazy, the explosive variety and sheer sonic brilliance of every moment cannot be overstated. I like accidentally right-clicked. I was like, oh shoot, if I left-click, it's going to advance the slide. But I actually wanted to advance the slide. I had forgotten I had a little sub-point about this. I didn't need to come up with my own words. I already wrote these words. Easy. I don't know. It's a hard album to talk about. Because it's like, you can go on and on about what makes it great as music, but then it feels like you're kind of not talking enough about what makes it great as like a political statement. But then if you talk too much about what makes it great as a political statement, people will think like, oh, well, now I kind of get it. Like, I don't really need to hear something like that, I guess. And they won't realize just how amazing it is to listen to as an album. I don't know. It's tough. It's tough. So check out these tracks at least. These Walls, which I think is one of the great bridging of kind of a cultural story, an archetypal story, with Kendrick's own very personal history. I especially love this one because it forms the connection between his previous album, Good Kid, Mad City, and To Pimp a Butterfly. It talks about the fate of the person who killed Dave on to Good Kid, Mad City. It talks about him being locked up and stuff. It's really, really powerful to kind of put both of these albums in context with one another. And then on top of that, it has this like awesome, funky hook that's like hella catchy, and it's like, how are you doing all of this at once? And then The Blacker the Berry, an extremely powerful, extremely heated track that I think it opened up a lot of discussion around like when Kendrick is self-critical, does this become like almost victim blaming on the archetypal, on the kind of cultural and racial level? And I think the fact that it opens this sort of debate isn't like a knock to the quality of the song or of Kendrick's songwriting, but it just kind of adds to this like tension that the song generates, that you're not even sure to what extent. It's not like it's like an easy anthem to get behind, like All Right was. It's more like this place of kind of deep shame and regret within Kendrick himself, and like trying to negotiate how you can contextualize this with your kind of greater moral values. I don't know, it's really hard to talk about this album, but oh my god, the music is just so good on these. So even if you don't want to think about this stuff, I highly encourage of everyone, of course, to become politically active, to stand up against injustice, to fight for the downtrodden of society. But please also, just take the plunge and appreciate how amazing this music is. Okay, moving on. At number 14, we have Process by Sampha. So I first heard of Sampha on a leaked version of Kanye's Saint Pablo, and I was absolutely obsessed. This was before it was revealed that that was going to be like a bonus T-Lop song. I thought it was maybe indicative of a future Kanye album, that this was like the first leak from TurboGrafx 16, if you can remember when that was supposed to be the upcoming Kanye album. Yeah, I totally love Saint Pablo, and mostly because of Sampha, mostly because I thought Sampha was like this representation of a new era of Kanye. And I was so enamored, so in awe of his performance. And this was doubled down upon. I saw him performing on the Jimmy Fallon show. I just had it as like a recommended YouTube clip or something. And like I was brought to tears. He gave such a beautiful performance. Just him and the piano playing like a ballad that on paper I would have no interest in, but simply because of the sheer genius of his work, I was moved, so moved. So when I heard he had an album coming up, I was both very, very excited and a little dreadful, a little scared. Like, how could it measure up to what I had heard so far? This soul-stunning performance on live television, and a feature featuring Kanye's masterful production and, like spotlighted in that regard. It felt really unfair to be expecting an entire solo album from this guy to live up to it. But it did. Oh my god, it did. It completely blew away my expectations. I was so happy, so enthralled by this album, so overjoyed that it managed to actually live up to these lofty expectations. And what shocked me the most, and what really made me so happy that there was a whole album and not just these tiny little jewels of performance, was the variety. He really does everything. We facilitate through the production some really crazy, like next level rhythms and aesthetics. I thought it would be mostly just kind of his voice over minimal instrumentation. But no, his voice is actually like the foundation to do all sorts of crazy new emotional spaces. We go from a lobby, the bleary morning, smoking a cigarette, the sun coming up, to dark streets at night, running from some inarticulated danger, to his mother's house, peaceful, tranquil, and yet loss permeating all, to outer space, to the depths of his very soul. It's like the Final Fantasy VII of these sorts of albums. We really just do everything. And all of this, of course, is united by his seraphic voice. Now, before I had said that Frank Ocean was my absolute favorite vocal talent in this genre, that was a lie. It's actually Sampha. Again, I'm doing this for drama. There's another level. And what really gets me is, despite that this album is just dripping with like obvious beauty and musicality and meaning, it really feels like all of your particular favorite parts, the parts that really stand out to you and feel memorable to you, are ones that you as an individual discover through repeated listens. I don't know really how that works, but it feels quite special to me. It feels very intimate. That I notice like one little thing that he does with his voice, or one little trick in the production that I'm like, that's very important to me. My recommended tracks are the opener, Plastic 100 Degrees Celsius. This has, I think, the best example of a moment that I feel like I discovered. I will leave it as an exercise to the listener to find their own moments. But really compelling track, really showing the variety of the production and stuff. Really rich in imagery and kind of an emotional space. And then, of course, one of his more famous songs now, No One Knows Me Like the Piano at My Mother's Home. And this is the song I heard him play on the Jimmy Fallon show. I watched him perform it quite a few times since then, and every time it moves me to tears, just thinking about what this song means to him and thinking about him sitting at his mother's piano, the familiarity of it, knowing that this was where his genius was forged. Okay, moving on to number 13. We have this bizarre-looking album cover that I still cannot make heads or tails of. Peasant by Richard Dawson. I'm still up here. Let's do a little tour. Yay! It's Peasant! So, everything I praised about 2020, the vivid, diary-like writing, the authenticity of character, the feeling of kind of inevitability and the mundanity of the stories, all of that is still true, but now we've transported ourselves. I don't think this should be. Well, actually, now I can't remember. But we've gone a ways into the past. It's either the year 1500 or it's the year 500. I don't know. I think it's actually the year 500. I think I'm right. It's like I'm always like skeptical of the me in the past that wrote the slides. Whenever there's like factual information, I'm always like, wait a minute. But it's like, well, why wouldn't I have just looked it up when I was writing the slides? Anyways, the composition of this one generally kind of lacks like anachronisms. Unlike 2020, which has all sorts of crazy kind of electronic elements, this one is mostly performed on acoustics, but nevertheless, it's still absolutely wild. It rampages across all structural convention with these gigantic transcendental finales that just leave me in awe every time I hear them. That, you know, the song seems normal enough up until a point, got some verses, got some choruses, and then things just go off the rails into a brand new world. There's no hesitation in plunging into discord, noise, other abrasiveness. His guitar is famously like out of tune, semi-broken, warped, something, I don't know, but he just keeps jamming on it anyways. There's sections of complete chaos break down into noise and stuff. His voice swings from this angelic falsetto that you could hardly believe could emerge from someone like him to the more muddy warbling to this just unstoppable titanic baritone. I cannot overstate the range and power of his voice on this album. But despite all of this frenzy, there's still this kind of weird sense of tradition behind it. It feels like all of these songs are written by the characters in the time for kind of an accurate purpose. And what I mean by that is, like, if you think of peasantry, and you think of peasantry who get to learn music, which was actually quite a few of them back then, who compose music and play songs in their spare time, I imagine it would be quite a lot like this, almost kind of a medieval blues, where they're expressing the hardships they're going through and sharing remarkable stories and speaking of things they've heard, rumors and legends. Everything is still very much in line with that. There's no kind of anachronistic meta perspective that teaches us some kind of more profound and calculated lesson. It's all just emerging from how the characters would want to express themselves. And from these stories that the characters tell, it feels like the substantive gap of a whole millennium, or more than a millennium, according to myself, is closed. That we bridge between Peasant and 2020 through the similarities of these experiences. We feel the emotions of these people that are long, long dead. We know that they felt like how we feel now. Not that I'm claiming this album is entirely historically accurate. I know that he took some liberties in terms of what sorts of technologies and practices were available when, and I don't know. But it's not about that. It's about the fact that we realize something that we must have known to be true all along, that the people back then really were people. They weren't that different than us. They had the same kind of capabilities, the same kind of sensory processing. They experienced the world, albeit a very different world, the way that we do. But this only heightens the mystery. To know that these people were so similar to us is to now place all of that gap into the mystery of their world. And not just our centuries, millennia removed perspective, it's mysterious, but to them as well. There's a deep mystery that I think is the major difference between their conception of the world and ours. And from this kind of wonder, from this feeling of being kind of lost within their own reality, I find that there's this bizarre sense of depravity that emerges. And it's a really compelling feeling that I get from some sort of media that depicts this kind of distance, this kind of like other culture. I find it really compelling and really rare. Some other good examples are like the Ingmar Bergman movie The Seventh Seal. Swampletics gives me these vibes if I think about it, not from like the perspective of it being a game, but from what it would be like to live in Mauritania and be aware of Swampletics and the sort of things he's doing. If you don't know what Swampletics is, search for it on my channel. I have an intro video. Or the Old Testament, reading the Old Testament and taking it kind of out of context and really thinking about how the human beings in those stories are behaving and what the world was like for them sometimes gives me this feeling. But it's kind of like a feeling at the depths of these pieces of media that I kind of have to unlock. And the same is true here, but it's like really, like sometimes it feels like, I don't know, like mind-blowingly compelling. It's like I need to know what it was like to see the world back then. Okay, my recommended tracks, first Ogre, which has this sort of transcendental finale that I'm talking about before, and in the lyrics I think really expresses this wonder at the world, where they start listing off all these activities that they're going to do while the sun is climbing and when the sun is dying. And I think it really represents kind of how the extent to which someone could comprehend their place in the world. Super fascinating. Weaver is more in line with most of the tracks in the album, that it takes the title of a profession, it imagines someone of that profession and kind of their day-to-day experiences, and then kind of a particular event that kind of stands out to them. And in this one, things again kind of break down into this crazy finale, and it's really hard to explain. Very rich, vivid imagery as well. Really, really cool album. I'm so glad that I learned about it. Can't wait to see what he does next. And then at number 12, we have Good Kid, Mad City by Kendrick Lamar, which I was talking about a bit during the To Pimp a Butterfly review. And it kind of took me a bit to get into this album when it first came out. I'll be honest with you, I was not a huge initial fan. And in fact, I went quite a long time without even listening to it. So it just kind of felt a bit pretentious. That, you know, I looked at the album cover, it says like a short film by Kendrick Lamar. I looked at the song titles and I was like, wow, this guy's taking himself really seriously. There's all these like sketches, skits, I guess is what I mean here, between songs that at first I was like, yeah, okay, I get it. It's like a concept album or whatever. Come on, really, come on. I'll admit this. I'll admit all of this. I'm embarrassed. I'm trying to like make fun of myself because I don't know how it is that I was so feeling so above this. But oh man, I had no idea that it was gonna sound so amazing. That like putting aside all of the concept behind it, putting aside Kendrick's ambitions and whether or not they're met or not, it sounds so good, this album. The production is so rich and enveloping. There's a really engrossing attention to detail. Every little bit of the sound has been paid special attention. It's so varied. We get the classic West Coast bangers, cycling all the way back to like Dr. Dre and contemporary, to like really minimal jazz, to brand new worlds of sound that even now people are studying in depth, the beats to try to figure out how this magic was wrought. Kendrick's performance, of course, is an undeniable testament to genius and power in rap. I think it's telling. There's a little story for you. I was hanging out. I used to work in like a writing center. Like we would. It was run by the university I was going to, and we would help edit people's papers and stuff. So I was hanging out there with some of the other tutors, and we got talking about music and stuff. What kind of music are you into? And I was like, oh, I'm like really, really into hip hop. Like I mostly listen to hip hop these days. And one guy was like, oh, I never really saw the appeal. It just kind of seems like stupid. Like they don't really say anything of substance. And you know, saying that sort of thing really bothers me, kind of offends me on some level. But I didn't want to like pick that fight. Instead, I just wanted to be like, okay, but there is some hip hop music you're going to appreciate. I'm sure of it. And I knew this guy was really into poetry. This was the type of nerdy English student that wrote sonnets in his free time. Pretty good sonnets too. So I was like, okay, like listen to Kendrick Lamar, listen to Good Kid, Mad City, and read along with the lyrics and like think about the sort of stories he's telling, the sort of imagery he's using, the level of like poetic brilliance behind all of those things I know you love, assonance and consonance, internal rhyme, meter. Like just appreciate it on that level at least. You know, then we can talk about subject matter. Then we can talk about like the intents of the genre and stuff. So I think the fact that my mind immediately went to this album um, is proof of something. Proof of something how I feel. But the thing is, it's not just like virtuoso for the sake of virtuoso. Everything serves the emotional space of the song, of the message of the overall album. His virtuoso talent shines through that, of course, because he's always going to do it in the most jaw-droppingly impressive way possible. But it's not for the sake of itself. And from all of this gripping sonic narrative, from the sound of the album itself, the story unfolds from the bottom up. So what I mean by that is it's from the top down would be like you read a synopsis of what happens on the story of the album. And then you hear it, you're listening to like the words primarily, and then eventually you kind of shift your focus to the production and the beat and stuff like that. But no, it's the opposite. At first you're so engrossed by the production and the beat, eventually you start to pick up on what's really being talked about and delivered in the lyrics on kind of a more deep and complete level. And then from that, you start to piece together the overall narrative of the album. And because of that, when you study the lyrics, when you're kind of at that highest level, and you're learning the kind of contextual knowledge and kind of learning about what Compton was like when Kendrick was this age and the stories behind the stories being told, it's so resonant because you've already felt everything so deeply. You've already latched onto it emotionally so that the meaning just kind of enhances everything at that point. I think this must be my favorite storytelling concept album with this level of like directness in the storytelling. You can make arguments that like everything is a concept album, that every album tells some sort of story. Sure, maybe. There's some other albums further on this list that certainly tell some sort of story, sure. But none of them feel this level of directness in that we're seeing like, you know, characters talking to each other. Characters, these are real people, but hearing people talk to each other between tracks and kind of updating the plot and this almost like musical sense of like a situation is developed and then song breaks out. I think this has to be my favorite when you're operating with that kind of structure. And again, something that I dismissed as kind of inherently pretentious. I don't generally like that kind of level of storytelling in my albums. It feels kind of unnecessary, and I'm not a fan of musicals either as the genre. That's too broad. I mean, there's definitely musicals I like, but overall, I'm not seeking them out, so to speak. But none of that mattered. The sheer quality of this album overpowered all. And for all of this, I can forgive even Poetic Justice. I've never liked that song. I think the Drake verse is so bad, and the hook is like kind of annoying to me. So even with a song on here that I just like don't even like, this album is still number 12. So the songs I would recommend though, Money Trees, an absolute modern classic. The production on it is just heavenly. There's a video on YouTube where they talk about how the beat was made. They kind of break down how the sample was flipped and stuff. I really recommend that because it's interesting in how it doesn't demystify it, but only just heightens your appreciation and this sense of otherworldliness of it. And then I think this was the track that I specifically recommended to my friend, Sing About Me, I'm Dying of Thirst, a gigantic multi-phase song near the end of the album that features kind of the climax of the whole story, the major kind of revolutions and revelations, and just features some of Kendrick's, I think, best writing in terms of just sheer spitting verses. And just like These Walls on To Pimp a Butterfly, this one actually also connects back to Kendrick's previous album, Section 80. And again, that sort of self-intertextuality, I think, is just so cool, so engrossing. Okay, from here we will move to number 11, the final album of this section, which is Seven Idiots by World's End Girlfriend. So this is actually my favorite concept album. Haha, kidding again. I gotta keep lying for hype. This one is about a plunge from heaven into hell expressed through avant-garde, multi-genre instrumental music. This, of course, is not pretentious at all. I don't know. Obviously, I'm kidding. This has nowhere near the level of directness of Good Kid, Mad City. It's much more abstractly expressed that this is kind of the plot. Mostly through the song titles is it actually at all recognizable, unless you're like a huge nerd that's listened to this like 500 times like I have. So, at first, Maeda, World's End Girlfriend, is kind of content. He's just flexing his compositional skills in a variety of pastiche modes, tackling genres and tropes, wandering between them along the weirdest and catchiest paths. Just kind of highlighting not just the stuff he loves about, say, classic rock or that kind of like bass slapping funk or any number of other genres, but bringing out what he finds like the weirdest in them, isolating sounds and juxtaposing them in ways that the most familiar becomes the most alien. His uncanny knack for developing innately hype moments of expectation and satisfaction, even in the depths of the swirling sonic inferno, never ever ceases to amaze me. Yeah, I've been listening to this album for over 10 years now. I think it came out really early 2010. But there's still moments where it feels like he's charging something up, and then the way he like unleashes it in this most glorious, satisfactory way, mwah, fantastic. Just a genius of songwriting. But then, as we explore the purgatory and deeper still into the inferno, and what belies belong even then, everything begins to spill its guts. Everything becomes this pure disjoint noise and chaos. The emotions this evokes in me, I really have no sane terms for. But I would call it, I guess, a manic, paralyzing captivation. I'm thinking everything, but also nothing, as my mind tries to puzzle out the nature and relation of all of these chaotic sounds. It's certainly difficult to sound like you're whole of brain and in a safe place when you're talking about how this sort of music affects you. But I wouldn't trade it for the world. It's very special to me. Please. When I listen to a lot of World's End Girlfriend music, what I think is, ooh, this would sound so cool in a rhythm game. Just the chaos of it, the insane rhythms, the aggressive velocity of the notes that would be flying at you. I really think he's the perfect choice to compose boss songs for various Bamani games. Let's let it happen. DD Mouse is in 2DX. That's another Virgin Babylon compadre, comrade? I don't know what I was trying to say, of World's End Girlfriend. They're buds. Let them on Bamani, Konami. Anyways, my recommended tracks, if this thing would go away. Les Enfants du Paradis, obviously from near the beginning of the album when we're still in paradise. Really, really catchy, really kind of jaunty and uplifting track that I think highlights a lot of his compositional skills, his ability to bring those feelings out of you in the weirdest way through things that kind of on paper seem like they have no appeal. And then the whole of Bohemian Purgatory in 3 parts, which is over 20 minutes long. Yes, I will recommend a whole episode of Seinfeld of this kind of noise decaying into chaos. It's really unique, really powerful, just a complete journey unto itself. And if you like that, then I'm sure you'll like the rest of the album, but I'm going to guess that a lot of people won't like that. Okay, we only have 1 part left. Only 10 albums remain. Can you guess what they are? If anyone manages to guess in the comments the final 10 albums before the next part comes out, I'll do something. I don't know. I won't have time to check though because I'm going to record the next part like today. So this plan makes no sense. Anyways, yeah, try to guess. I'll be impressed. I'm having a blast recording these. I'm so happy that this is actually happening at last. I'm hoping you're enjoying hearing me ramble on and on and on about music. I hope you're finding some artists and albums for you to check out as well. And yeah, I'll see you tomorrow for the last 10.